Welcome to FMH Insurecast, a podcast created by Farmers Mutual Hail designed to deliver expertise and insights from trusted FMH team members and industry experts. Each new episode will dive into new products, industry updates, and innovative solutions. Let's get to today's topic.
Well, welcome back to the FMH Insurecast. On today's episode, we are talking Farm Bill news and reminders on Prevent Plant. Our focus today will be on the wet conditions that exist around the Midwest, but we're also going to discuss some of the insurance implications of the recent Farm Bill proposals. But before we do that, we're going to quickly plug a very special event we have here at FMH. And with me to talk about that event is Pat Faga. He is the Chief Marketing Officer here at FMH. And go ahead, tell us a little bit more about this event.
Thanks, Ryan. Glad to be here. Super excited about our upcoming event. It's one of my favorite FMH events. It's going to be held here at the home office parking lot on Thursday, June 20th, from 4:30 to 8. It'll be our 19th annual event where we shave heads to benefit children's cancer research. Last year, we had a record amount of raised cash, $107,000. We're hoping to surpass that this year. With the support of our employees, our staff, as well as our corporate partners. So super
Awesome.
excited.
No, that is great. And one of the main reasons we wanted to bring this to the Insurecast is because my head is being shaven. So I am going to lose even more of my hair on June 20th. But we do have a link to a page where you can donate specifically to my cause in trying to raise money for the St. Baldrick's event. Pat, anything else you would just add here?
The Iowa Chrome Domes have been doing this for 19 years, and we're glad to have you as part of the Chrome Dome group to raise money. It benefits local causes as well as national causes with child cancer research, specifically Blank Children's Hospital here, but also out in other communities that are doing research across the nation. So super excited about being involved. And like I say, it's one of my favorite events. It's a family-friendly event. We'll have events for kids. We'll have events for adults. We'll have food and beverage provided. So just ask everybody to come out and take part. And if you can't take part personally, go to the website, like you said, Ryan, and do a donation that way.
Yes, and you will be able to see the results because we do post all of these videos on YouTube. So any Insurecast that we record after that June 20th date, you will see my bald head. So you get to see the results. But well, thank you very much, Pat, for joining us and talking about this event. And please feel free to donate to the great cause. And thanks again for being here, Pat.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
And now switching over to some crop insurance topics. Going to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill here, just personally, and these are Farm Bill proposals. We've gotten multiple proposals out there in the past couple of weeks, and just wanted to talk through basically where you can see there was a clear emphasis being made by the folks that are writing up these bills. And by no means does it mean that these items are definitely going to happen, but as far as implications for crop insurance, they seem to be uniformly in favor of the following items. One, there's clearly a specialty crop emphasis. There's a lot of language in these bills that would enhance the number of products and crops that we have out there that are insurable, and possibly some more dollars going to agents that are writing those types of plans. There's also clearly an effort to extend and enhance the beginning farmer benefits. The beginning farmer benefits oftentimes are being proposed to extend out to 10 years and even increase the subsidy benefit there. Those things are a little bit more mixed, but they're all uniformly in attempts to try and increase the beginning farmer benefits. And then we also have an increase to the subsidy percentage and the level of SCO in particular. Now, on the flip side, there's also enhancements that are being proposed for the ARC and PLC programs, which if you know crop insurance, you know that SCO and ARC can't be bought together, but it puts them in continued conflict, but both of them enhanced in the fact that it will be cheaper to buy SCO and you can get a higher level. And then lastly, kind of what I mentioned there, the opportunity to update base acres and increase the reference prices used for the ARC and PLC programs. Those are also uniformly in all of these Farm Bill proposals so far. So just kind of sharing that information more than anything. These certainly can get cut before the final Farm Bill is released. And it seems like we might have a small window here. It is May 14th. It seems like we have a small window here where maybe they could get a Farm Bill done. I still think the chances from the articles and things that I've been reading are fairly low, but those items being included in all of the proposals are all positives for crop insurance and get me excited. And so we're going to keep a close eye on those programs. And as they become more solidified, we will be sure to go through more of the implications of where we stand with those, with the new Farm Bill. That said, we are here to talk about Prevent Plant. And I'm thinking that maybe by just having this podcast about Prevent Plant, we can make it disappear. That would be very nice. But I have a guest on to talk about Prevent Plant. George Raife, you have been on the podcast before to talk about Prevent Plant.
I have, about 2 years ago.
And can you just remind us what you do here at FMH and tell us a little bit?
I am a claims analyst here at FMH.
Okay.
So I audit claims that get worked out in the field. I've been with the company for almost 16 years now, and I've been fortunate enough the last 7 years to be working in the claims department.
Wonderful. And I say myself, knowing because I ask you questions often about Prevent Plant, you seem to be pretty up to snuff on all things Prevent Plant. So it's great to have you as a guest here today. The first thing I want to mention, again, it is May 14th. Yesterday, we got a planting progress report. And up until this most recent planting progress report, you could see we were actually ahead of schedule compared to past years. Clearly it took a step backwards with this most recent planting progress report. And there's especially in the heart of the Corn Belt, Iowa, Illinois, and other states surrounding have fallen behind. And forecast, however, I think because I asked Carrie, our marketing specialist who helps put these podcasts together, I think I asked her earlier this week. I looked at the forecast. It was looking bad. All of a sudden, we're recording. I looked at the 7-day forecast. I don't see much rain here for Des Moines in the next 7 days.
No, it doesn't look like there's going to be much.
Fingers crossed, maybe we will make this all disappear. But in case it doesn't, we do want to give you guys several reminders, a holistic view of what Prevent Plant is and what your options are and implications of what you do with that ground if it is indeed put into that Prevent Plant category. So we're going to start by hopefully, even if we don't have a Prevent Plant, we don't have to late plant. But let's talk about late planting first. We have final plant dates, and those final plant dates vary by crop and by area. Just to give the audience an idea here, in our eastern states of the Corn Belt, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, that final plant date is June 5th. You move further to the west, Iowa, Minnesota, parts of Wisconsin, and Missouri, that plant date is May 31st. And then you go further west, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, that date is generally May 25th. So we're getting very close to those dates in the western area. George, tell me what happens if we are not able to plant before those final plant dates?
Well, some crops, but not all, and again, it can depend on the area as well, would have a late plant period, which is anywhere from 10 to 25 days generally. I know in Iowa, it's 25 days for corn, where you can still plant during that period and get insurance. The thing to keep in mind with those late plant periods is each day you are delayed, you lose 1% of your guarantee.
Yep.
Even if you're not able to get planted during that late plant period, you could still get insurance for your crop, even if you plant after the end of the late plant period, but your guarantee is going to be drastically reduced. It's going to be the same as the base Prevent Plant coverage level, but you still do have some options.
Yes, exactly. And I would just offer this up. We say you lose 1% of your guarantee. Said in almost, I think, an easier way, you lose 1% of your APH per day. So if we have 200 bushel APH and we plant 5 days late, we've lost 1% of 200 each of those days, which is 10 bushels. So we've lost 10 bushels, 5% of our total APH. So Nothing wrong with planting into the late plant period. I would just suggest that for farmers, do the math. And we're going to help assist with some of the math here first. But the first math you're going to do is, okay, what if I plant 5 days late or 10 days late? How does that affect my guarantee? What do I believe my potential still is? And is it worth it for me to continue to try to plant? Because once we hit that final plant date, that is our first opportunity to declare prevent plant. Is that correct, George?
Correct.
Okay. And if we declare prevent plant, what does that earn us? So here's a quick a way to calculate for we're going to use corn today, our prevent plant payment. So our prevent plant payment is going to be our APH times our level of coverage times the spring price. In this case for 24 was $466 for most areas. And then we multiply that times the prevent plant factor. And for different crops, it does vary. For corn, it's 55%. For soybeans, it's 60%. For other crops, it can be much lower than that. But so for instance, on a 220 bushel APH with an 80% level, that would have a prevent plant payment of $451. That's 220 times 80% times 466 times that prevent plant factor of 55%. If we have maybe a slightly different area, a lower APH of maybe 170, we take a lower coverage of 75%, that is actually a $327 prevent plant payment. So when I see those, I would say most farmers are going to fall into that $300 to $500 an acre prevent plant payment for corn. And corn is by far our most popular prevent plant crop.
It's pretty popular.
It's pretty popular. And when I look at those numbers though, and understanding how most farmers' fixed costs look, there's not a whole lot of margin there to make money, so to speak, off of a prevent plant claim. So if we are in an area where we have a 220 bushel APH and our prevent plant payment will be $450, I'm imagining land costs, rent costs are north of $300, and then you have other fixed costs that go on top of that. So just to give you an idea, those are the kind of ranges of payments that we have going into this year. But back to when prevent plant becomes an option, it's after our final plant date, and we have to have an insurable cause. Obviously, what we're talking about here today, and the reason why we wanted to put this podcast on is because much of the Midwest is experiencing very wet conditions, but that is not the only way that you could qualify for a prevent plant loss, correct, George?
That is correct, yeah.
So what else could we have?
Well, there are several different causes. Obviously, excess moisture, precipitation, rain is the most common, but you can also be prevented from planting due to drought or the actual technical cause is for another one is failure of the irrigation water supply, where drought could be if the ground's just too dry, where if you try to disc it up or you try to put a planter through it, everything's just going to blow away. You're just going to lose all that soil. With irrigation, if you're in an area that relies strongly on irrigation, I know a lot of places further out west, that's a big deal. If they don't get the snowfall during the winter that they would traditionally get, and they don't get the chance to refresh those groundwater sources, their irrigation district might drastically cut the amount of water they're going to be allotted for the crop year. So that can also be an insurable cause of loss that would justify a prevent plant claim.
Perfect. So we have, for the sake of the rest of this, we're going to be mostly talking in terms of wetness, because I think that's what we're most concerned about here today, because there's different criteria that might need to be met if you have those types of
there are
prevent plant losses. But so we have to be past the final plant date. We have to have that insurable cause, in this case, excessive moisture. What other criteria have to be met in order to qualify for a prevent plant claim?
There's a number of them, but one thing I do want to mention real quick, you need to be past the final plant date in order to declare or file a claim for prevent plant, but there is no requirement that you try to plant during the late plant period if one is applicable. You can just hit the final plant date and you can file a claim for prevent plant. We're not going to require you to try and get in during that late plant period. But there are a couple of other qualifications for prevent plant. The first one being what we call the 2020 rule. And that is where the prevented acres have to constitute the lesser of either 20 acres or 20% of the acres in the unit. And if you happen to have enterprise units, again, kind of getting that benefit from the enterprise units, you can aggregate between several of those underlying optional units to meet that qualification. As always, you need to have a timely submitted notice of loss. Generally, that's within 72 hours of the final plant date. However, it states in the Prevented Planting Standards Handbook that if the AIP can determine that they can still accurately determine the loss, and the prevented acres were reported on a timely submitted acreage report, that we could still potentially accept that notice of loss, as long as that notice of loss is not submitted any later than 60 days after the end of the insurance period. So yes, it is 72 hours, but there is some leeway there. Another sort of qualification is that the cause of loss is common to the area and it's documentable. So multiple producers throughout the county are not able to get planted because it's too wet. But there may be instances where there's one producer in the county that can't get planted and files for prevent plant, but the guy down the road manages to get a crop in. We don't automatically rule that out. We will kind of review that on a case-by-case basis, because there could be a lot of underlying factors that aren't immediately clear that could prevent an individual from planting.
The nature of the ground.
Exactly.
Yes.
Web soil survey can help us with that information. There could be low-lying bottom ground that just stays wet, you know, and there's a number of sources that we can go to for information to help prove that, but we don't automatically rule that out right out of the gate.
But I think it is important, and I want to make this an emphasis here. It is important, if you are in that position where it is not common to the area, that's where the documentation becomes much more important.
Yes,
Correct?
it is extremely important. As with any crop insurance claim, the documentation that backs up your cause of loss, you know, backs up your production, those are incredibly important to help prove the case.
Awesome. And I think we have at least one more rule here to talk about to qualify for a claim.
So this one is very near and dear to my heart personally, and that is what we call the 1 in 4 rule. Now, I am going to read this. I'm going to quote you chapter and verse from the Prevented Planting Standards Handbook here. So this comes out of paragraph 26, which is all about establishing eligibility for prevent plant. So that acreage eligible for prevent plant must be available for planting. In order for the acreage to be considered physically available for planting, the acreage must, in at least one of the 4 most recent crop years immediately preceding the current crop year, have been planted to a crop. For prevent plant determinations only, planted includes annual regrowth of a perennial forage or mint crop. Must have been planted using recognized good farming practices. It must have been insured under the authority of the Act being the Federal Crop Insurance Act, or NAP. And now here's the big part, that was harvested, or if not harvested, was adjusted for claim purposes under the authority of the Act or NAP due to an insured cause of loss other than a cause of loss related to flood, excess moisture, drought, or any other cause of loss specified in the special provisions. So in the most simplest form, the 1 in 4 rule requires that a piece of ground has been planted, harvested, and insured in at least one of the 4 most recent crop years.
That's how I like to say it.
Yeah.
The language is thick, but I'm glad you went through it. But that is it. It's, was your ground, all 3 of these, planted, harvested, and insured in at least one of the most recent 4 crop years?
Yeah. So this 1 in 4 rule can sometimes present some challenges, just trying to prove that history. If it's an insured that's been with our company for a number of years, it's usually pretty easy. But where it can become a little bit more difficult is if a producer picks up new ground and they then need to get some sort of documentation from whoever was producing on that ground previously. I ran into a situation a few years ago out in Nebraska where a producer acquired a new piece of ground. It had been prevented the first year, and this was before 1 in 4 was applicable in that state. But the second year, they had to meet the 1 in 4 requirement, and the person that they had gotten this ground from, it was not an amicable situation, would not provide any sort of documentation, just refused to provide any sort of documentation to show that it met that requirement. Unfortunately, we had no other recourse. We weren't able to find anything using our resources to prove that. So we actually had to deny that claim. But generally, it's pretty easy, but there are situations where it can be a little bit more troublesome.
Sure. Couple of quick notes on that. 1 in 4 rule follows the ground, not the farmer.
Correct.
Follows the ground, not the farmer. The 1 in 4 rule was previously isolated to the prairie pothole region. Then it's since expanded, but it has disappeared in some places at different years. For the most part, in 2024, we're looking at the 1 in 4 rule being fairly universal. But there are some states out west that do not have the 1 in 4 rule on certain crops.
Beginning with crop year 2023, I think, is when certain western states, namely, so if you can essentially draw a line up from Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, west, no longer had to meet the 1 in 4 requirement. And that is, for the current crop year, I still believe is the case for those states.
Okay.
But from anything east of there still does need to meet the 1 in 4 requirement.
Got it. A couple more items. One thing that can catch farmers: ground coming out of CRP.
Yep.
Ground coming out of CRP would naturally not qualify because it does not meet that 1 in 4 rule. And then another note here, this has since changed, but if you have a stand of forage, alfalfa, you may have harvested it and insured it, but you technically didn't plant it. RMA says that's okay. As long as you are consistently getting cuttings off of that alfalfa, that is considered planted.
That was a point of contention for a number of years.
Yes. So we're good there. So that's the 1 in 4 rule.
That is.
What other exciting rules do we have to talk about?
Well, there's a couple of other things. We spoke about the 2020 rule previously, but there's also the 2020 field rule, which comes down to the field level, where all planted fields must have at least 20 acres or 20% of the ground that's unplanted in order to declare a PP crop different than what is planted in that field. Sometimes what we would refer to as split field history. But a few years ago, I think this was in 2020 or 2021, RMA put out kind of a vague, broad statement that as long as the producer could prove intent to plant the prevented crop, then they didn't need to prove that split field history. And they didn't give us a whole lot of guidance on what exactly was proof of their intent. And we kind of developed some guidelines here for, within the office here. We're looking at input receipts. Did the producer buy the seed? Was there adequate seed to plant the area that they're claiming is prevented? Had they applied any sort of fertilizer, herbicide, anything like that? Also looking at the history of the operation, would the crop rotation have normally been the crop that they're claiming is prevented? That kind of stuff we'll accept as proof that they intended to originally plant that prevented crop. If we are not able to get that proof and we can't meet that 2020 field rule, let's say that we're claiming prevented corn on 15 acres out of a 100-acre field. If we don't have any proof of that intent, well, that 15 acres of prevented corn now becomes 15 acres of prevented soybeans, which is going to decrease the prevent plant payment on that a little bit.
Correct. And so to that end, we talked about the prevent plant payments on corn, and typically, if you have eligibility, that's why corn ends up being the most popular prevent plant crop. But if you run out of corn eligibility, which we're going to talk about acre eligibility here in a second, it could be rolled or borrowed to do another crop. And we'll probably leave that topic alone.
Yeah, that can get a little bit complicated.
It can get a little complicated, but you could end up collecting a prevent plant payment on ground that you even intended to plant to corn, but it might be borrowed from a different crop on your policy if you have run out of eligibility. And so how do we end up running out of eligibility? Let's talk about your acre eligibility. So I'll kick this one off and just say that it's the most acres of a crop planted and prevented from being planted in the last 4 years. So for instance, for corn, if I have 1,000-acre farming operation, I'm looking back at my last 4 years. Out of that 1,000 acres, how many acres have I planted to corn, and whatever is the highest number in that last 4 years, that is what I'm going to use for my corn eligibility. If I also have prevent plant acres that were in those last 4 years, those also count towards my eligibility as well. So let's just say, for instance, in that example, the most acres of corn I planted in the last 4 years was 600 acres. Okay, 600 acres. That becomes my corn eligibility, and I can get paid on corn prevent plant acres up to 600.
Well, there's actually a couple of factors we need to kind of put into that equation.
Okay.
So we're looking at, just like you said, we're looking at the highest number of planted acres in the 4 most recent crop years. We're going to take that as your base eligibility.
Okay.
What we're going to do, and this is going to happen on the back end, this isn't going to necessarily be easy to calculate, but we're going to look at what you have planted for the current crop year. So we're then going to take that highest total from the last 4 years. We're going to subtract out the number of acres that you planted in the current year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to leave us with our actual crop eligibility for that current year. Then if there were acres that were paid at 100% prevent plant in the past, now that's the important thing to remember.
Okay.
We can then add those back in to increase your acre eligibility. The flip side of that is if you had any acres that were paid at 35% prevent plant, where, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later,
Mm-hmm.
if you planted a second crop following a prevented plant, we actually do have to remove those acres from the eligibility.
Okay.
So it's simplest way of putting it is we're going to take the highest number of planted acres in whichever one of the 4 most recent crop years. We're going to then subtract out the planted acres for the current crop year, and then that's going to be your eligibility for that particular crop for the current crop year.
And George, I get this question a lot. My farming operation's been that 1,000 acres for the last 4 years, but this year I am planning to add 500 new acres to my operation. What happens to my eligibility?
You must have had one heck of a good year last year if you can afford to add 500 acres.
Well, I was lucky.
Well, in that instance, we have what we call an added land factor.
Okay.
And what that added land factor is, it's a factor derived from the current year cropland acres. So let's say 1,500 acres in our operation this year,
Mm-hmm.
divided by the acres that we had last year. So 1,000 acres. So I think that would give us a factor of 1.5.
Mm-hmm.
So then we'll take that added land factor of 1.5 and we'll multiply that by our eligibility to increase the eligibility a little bit.
Right.
But one really important thing to remember about an added land factor is we have to net any gains and losses. So in a slightly simpler example, let's say we had 200 acres in the operation last year.
Mm-hmm.
We lost 50 acres. We lost the lease to it or something, but we managed to pick up another 100. So we have 250 acres in the operation, but we actually only netted a gain of 50.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to make sure that we're netting, like I said, netting the gains and losses. So if we had that 200 acres in 2023, we lost 50 acres, but we picked up 50 acres, that's a net zero gain or loss. So there wouldn't be any added land factor applicable there.
Got it. Nope, that makes sense. I just know that farmers and sometimes agents even get to the point where they're starting to look at their eligibility and then they share these numbers with the farmer, and the farmer's like, whoa, I was planning on planting a lot more than that this year. And they have that panic moment. For the most part, that added land factor should quell those worries. So,
It can. Yeah.
So-
But again, it's also important. It needs to be ground that is new to the operation.
Yep.
So maybe you've had the ground for a few years, but you just haven't planted it. That's not technically added land. So that wouldn't qualify for an added land factor.
Fair enough. Okay. I've gotten through the situation. I've met all the qualifications. I've turned in a claim. I have, I feel comfortable. I'm going to qualify for this ground as prevent plant. What can I do with this ground now after the final plant date? And let's start with that first.
All right. Well, you've got some options.
Mm-hmm.
The most, I can't necessarily say the most common, but cover crops are a big opportunity now. We're starting to see a lot more push for cover crops. And those can also affect your payment a little bit depending on the situation. So even if you plant the cover crop before the final plant date or during the late plant period of your prevented crop, You can hay that cover crop, you can graze it, you can cut it for silage, haylage, or baleage at any time, and you will still get 100% of your prevent plant payment.
Just to be clear, because I know this is one question I had actually coming into here. I can plant a cover crop even during the late plant period?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's a cover crop.
That's a cover crop.
Okay.
I can't harvest it for grain.
Yes, that is on to the next one. So at the same time, if at any point you harvest, you or anyone else, that's another important thing to remember, is you or anyone else harvests that cover crop for grain or seed at any point, that completely wipes out your prevented planting payment. And that's, sometimes that's what happens, but that's not really a situation that you want to be in.
Yes.
Again, then our next scenario is if you plant it after the late plant period or the final plant date, if there's no applicable late plant period.
If we're planting what, a cover crop?
A cover crop.
Okay.
Yep, we're still on cover crop.
Okay.
And the rules are the same for a volunteer crop as well.
Okay.
So very similar. You can hay it, graze it, cut it for silage, haylage, or baleage at any time, and you still get 100% of your prevent plant payment. However, again, if at any point by any person that cover crop is harvested for grain or seed, it's going to reduce that payment by 65%. So you're going to be getting 35% of your prevent plant payment. And
in other words, that cover crop is now considered a second crop,
yes,
right? Our first crop being the prevented crop. Now our second crop being this cover crop, which we've harvested grain or seed off of. And tell us what those rules are.
Well, again, that kind of goes into the second crop option, where you could, let's say you're prevented from planting corn, and then after the end of, after the late plant period for corn, you can go in and plant soybeans.
Yep.
But since you have planted that second crop, it's going to reduce your corn payment by 65%. And this is a fairly common practice in certain areas of the country. But again, there are some, I don't want to say repercussions or consequences, but there are some big implications.
Oh, yes.
And, I certainly, we don't want to discourage anyone from doing that, because they're able to get another crop onto it that they can get, hopefully get some benefit out of. But they're also getting that reduction in their prevent plant payment as a result of doing that.
We're bouncing around here a little bit, but I want to circle back to cover crops for a second here. On those cover crops, there used to be a rule that said you couldn't do anything with that cover crop until after November 1st.
And that was moved back to like September 1st in 2020 due to the pandemic, but that has been completely removed.
So there's no rules against haying or grazing a cover crop at any time.
Yep,
and
you can do that at any
a couple
time.
times.
Yep.
Okay. Now back to what we call the second crop. And it doesn't matter if it was a cover crop that we planted after the end of the late plant period, or if it was truly a second crop that we intended to harvest. If we harvest it for grain, it's considered seed. It's considered a second crop. And you mentioned one of the repercussions, which is you only get 35% of your, in this case, we're using corn as the example. You're only getting 35% of your corn prevent plant payment. But also, and this is probably the bigger penalty, is there's long-term effects to your APH, because in that corn database, we will actually plug in 60% of your T yield. And so if you had a 200 bushel APH for that year, if you just had prevent plant and did nothing with that ground with a second crop, there's just nothing that goes in the database. But if you plant a second crop and you harvest it, then we plug in 120 bushels, 60% of your current APH. Obviously, that brings your APH down, and that 120 is going to be in there for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's another implication here.
The only exception to that would be if you're in a double cropping area and you do have qualifying double crop history. That's certain areas, again, that's pretty common, but that is not everywhere.
So without exception, if we have a prevent plant issue, say for corn, if we want to qualify for that corn prevent plant payment, we can't do anything with a true second crop that we intend to harvest until after the end of the late plant period. We could plant a cover crop before the end of the late plant period, but we definitely would not want to harvest that cover crop for grain or seed. But what else are we missing here? Because I think this is where people really get into no man's land, right? They've had prevent plant, and now they're like, what do I do with the ground? And farmers generally don't like to look at that ground just sitting there with nothing on it. I would say, from my experience, you tell me different, cover crops seem to be the most popular route.
Yeah.
We do see some planting and harvesting of a second crop after the end of that late plant period. But again, we talked about the implications there. You get a big reduction in the prevent plant payment, and we're plugging in that 60% of your APH. Anything else to look out for? I put in a note here about renting ground. Tell me about that.
So you're perfectly free to rent out the ground. You or your landlord can rent out that ground. However, we're going to run into that same again, I don't want to say issues, but we're going to run into that same situation if anyone plants a crop on that ground. It is considered a second crop, which again immediately leads to a 65% reduction in your prevented planting payment, and then you will get that 60% plug yield into your database. So someone's able to get a crop off of it, but there are after effects of doing that. Unless, again, it's a cover crop that is not harvested for grain or seed. Maybe there's a volunteer crop. Again, can't harvest it for grain or seed. But it's, as much as people don't like to look at a barren field, that's the only way, aside from a cover crop that's cut for silage, haylage, baleage, grazed, that's going to maintain that 100% prevent plant payment.
Yep. And I would say too, we always start to get into these gray areas where farmers are saying, well, is this a cover crop? Is this a cover crop? and you know, soybeans ends up being one. One big no-no, one thing that RMA makes very clear is that corn is not a cover crop.
Corn is not. Soybeans can be if it's planted at a cover crop specific rate.
Also, I would just caution, I'm not handing out advice here, but farmers that want to plant soybeans as a cover crop, I think have in the back of their mind that maybe if it turns out well, they'll still harvest it. And then, of course, then you have the other implications.
Then you have a second crop.
Right. Then you have a second crop, and you could run into some issues there. So, yeah, anything else on those topics before we get to our last
Well, I would
here?
just, one thing to quickly note about cover crops is there are certain guidelines that they do have to abide by. Last I knew is the NRCS guidelines that strictly speak to dates of when the cover crop has to be terminated prior to planting another crop. So cover crops are fantastic. I mean, they're great for the environment. They're great for helping, maintain all the soil nutrients and everything. But if you want to go that route, just make sure that you are aware of how you need to treat that crop, when you need to terminate that crop if you don't hay it or graze it or cut it for anything else.
Awesome. I just had a couple of quick tips here before I'll let you get in the last word, because you are the one that sees all of the claim paperwork that comes in on the on prevent plant here. But if you are prepared and you know that there might be some acres in your operation that won't qualify because they don't meet the 1 in 4 rule, or maybe you just don't have enough acres of eligibility, obviously we want to try to plant those acres first, right? That's thinking a long way ahead, and we're battling weather, and so who knows, what logistics might lead to what. But just a reminder, if you're aware of acres that may not qualify, try to get those done first. Do the math. If you're giving up, if you're going to choose to prevent plant, or if you are forced into prevent plant, be aware that especially when we get into the late plant period, if there becomes opportunities to plant, literally we're going to look at, okay, how was our APH affected? What coverage do we have remaining versus what am I leaving on the table by not taking a prevent plant payment? And so that's going to vary by situation, crop, everything, but doing the math is going to be helpful to make that decision. And let's see here. It's generally advantageous to declare, generally not advantageous to declare prevent plant and then plant to that second crop. That's not necessarily advice, but I know from talking with agents and farmers in areas that have frequent prevent plant, that situation tends to not work out so well in the long term. And mostly the implications are in that APH database with that 60% plug. All right, George, what are a couple of tips, a couple of things you see often enough that you would want to make sure that the audience of farmers and agents understands before we have a prevent plant situation?
Well, the biggest thing, especially in a year like this one, where I've gotten several calls from agents that are in areas that historically don't have a lot of prevent plant, they're just not sure how it works. And if you happen to be in one of that situations, I strongly encourage you to reach out to your local sales representative, or if you happen to know your local claims representative, reach out to them because they're very knowledgeable and they can help you answer some of those questions. If they're not sure the answer, they've got a huge support network they can reach out to. I know I've spoken to a number of our field staff as well to help answer those prevent plant questions. It's a necessary evil within the program, for lack of a better term. It's a really good piece of the program to have, because there are some producers whose entire operations get prevented and they would have no way of surviving without it. But very similar to what Ryan has said previously, is you're going to be in the long run better off if you can still get that crop in during the late plant period. We're still 2 weeks away from the final plant date here in Iowa, and then we have the better part of a month after that to still try and get that crop in. You're going to lose a little bit again of your APH, but you're still going to be able to get that crop in. You're going to get a much higher guarantee than if you were given the prevent plant guarantee. And then with a little bit of luck, a little bit of rain throughout the rest of this growing season, you'll have a harvestable crop that's going to generate a lot more for you than a one-time prevent plant payment.
Right. And I mentioned doing the math. It's not just about, do I take the prevent plant payment or do I plant the crop I was intending? The third option is moving to another crop altogether, right? So if we're intending to plant corn and it's getting too late, I think a lot of farmers also choose just to plant those acres to beans, even if they weren't intending that at the beginning of the crop year. Perfect. Well, thank you, George. Poof, we just made it all go away. Now we're not going to have any prevent plant issues.
That
right?
sounds fantastic to me. I sure hope that's how it works.
Yes. Awesome. Well, quick reminder, I am going to get my head shaved. There might be another podcast out before that actually is finished up, but keep a close eye on the Farm Bill proposals and implications. Things are definitely heating up in DC when it comes to the Farm Bill. And of course, we learned a lot today about prevent plant. So thank you again, George. And hopefully it doesn't mean a thing. So thank you all for listening very much. And don't forget to subscribe and also check our podcast out on your favorite platform, including now YouTube.
You've been listening to FMH Insurecast. We appreciate you joining us today and would like to hear from you. If you have questions about today's topic or an idea to share for an upcoming podcast, you can contact us at fmhpodcast@fmh.com. Thanks for listening. This podcast is intended for information purposes only. See policy provisions, terms, and conditions for details. Products underwritten by Farmers Mutual Hail Insurance Company of Iowa and its affiliates, West Des Moines, Iowa. Farmers Mutual Hail is an equal opportunity provider.